The air at Fort Hood, Texas, in the spring of 1958 hit Elvis Presley like a physical punch. It was hot, dusty, and smelled of sweat, canvas, and something vaguely metallic. Gone were the flashing lights of the stage, the roar of adoring crowds, the silk shirts, and the polished guitars. In their place, a rough, olive-drab uniform that itched in places he didn't even know he had. Presley. On the line, a voice boomed, cutting through the general chaos of new recruits stumbling off buses. Elvis, fresh off a cross-country train, still felt the rumble in his bones. He was used to being recognized, but this was different. Here, the recognition felt less like adoration and more like a challenge. Every eye seemed to bore into him, assessing, judging. He took a deep breath, trying to push down the familiar flicker of stage fright and replace it with something resembling military resolve. He joined the line, a motley crew of young men, some barely out of high school, others with the hard lines of a few years' experience. They all looked equally bewildered, equally out of their element. Except for him, of course. He was Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, and that, he quickly realized, was a problem. The man who had barked his name stomped forward. Drill Sergeant Hammer. The name fit. He was built like a brick wall with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite and eyes that could strip paint. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. All right, listen up. You sorry bunch of civilian softies. Hammer's voice was a gravelly growl that carried across the parade ground. My name is Drill Sergeant Hammer, and for the next 8 weeks, I'm your worst nightmare. You think this is some kind of vacation? You think this is a party? Wrong. This is basic training, and we're going to break you down and build you back up into soldiers. Understand? A chorus of hesitant, yes, Drill Sergeant, echoed back. Hammer's gaze swept over the recruits, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on Elvis. A smirk, cold and sharp, touched the corner of his lips. And for those of you who think you're special, he continued, his voice dropping slightly, but me tell you something right now. In this army, there are no special cases, no celebrities, no kings. You're all the same here. You're green, you're dumb, and you're mine. Got it, Presley? He wanted to retort, to explain, to remind them of the millions of records sold to screaming fans, but he clamped his jaw shut. He was just a soldier now. Yes, Drill Sergeant, he responded, his voice as firm as he could make it. Hammer's eyes narrowed. Good. Now you want to be a soldier, Presley, or are you going to whine about your aching feet and your fancy hair? Elvis swallowed. I want to be a soldier, Drill Sergeant. We'll see about that, Hammer muttered, turning his attention to the rest of the platoon. Now, drop and give me 20. Move. The ground was hard, rocky. Elvis dropped the rough fabric of his uniform, scraping his knees, started pushing up, trying to match the rhythm of the men around him. He'd always been active, energetic on stage, but this was a different kind of physical demand. His muscles burned, his breath hitched. He wasn't built for this kind of repetitive, grueling exercise. He pushed, sweat stinging his eyes. He could feel Hammer's eyes on him. He was performing, but this audience wasn't cheering. This audience was waiting for him to fail. 1, 2, 3. Hammer barked the count, his voice relentless. You call that a push-up, Presley? Get that chest to the ground. You gonna let a little ground defeat the king? Elvis gritted his teeth, his arms trembled. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to stop, to give up, to say he couldn't do it. But something else. A deep-seated stubbornness kicked in. He wasn't just Elvis Presley anymore. He was Private Presley, and he was not going to quit. He pushed down, scraping his chin on the dirt, then forced himself back up. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't perfect, but he kept going. He finished the 20, his muscles screaming, his breath ragged. On your feet, quickly, Hammer commanded. Elvis stumbled up, legs shaking. He wiped sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand. He glanced at Hammer, expecting another barb, but the drill sergeant's face was unreadable. All right, listen up. This is just the beginning, Hammer announced to the platoon. You're going to learn discipline. You're going to learn teamwork. You're gonna learn to push past what you thought were your limits, and by the time I'm done with you, you're gonna be proud to call yourselves soldiers of the United States Army. Now fall in, and try not to look so pathetic." As the recruits shuffled into formation, Elvis felt a strange mix of exhaustion and a new kind of resolve settling over him. This wasn't going to be easy, he knew that much, but maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what he needed. To be stripped bare of the fame, the expectations, and find out what was left underneath. He was no longer the king. He was just Presley, and he had a lot to prove, not to the world, but to himself, Sergeant Hammer. The sun beat down, turning the dusty parade ground into an oven. The next hours were a blur of paperwork, more shouting, more standing in line, and the ever-present feeling of being watched. Elvis felt the weight of the uniform, the unfamiliar feel of the combat boots on his feet. He saw the fleeting glances from his fellow recruits, the whispers that followed him. Like a shadow, "That's Elvis Presley. No way is it really him. Wonder if he can even march." He kept his eyes forward, his expression neutral. He just had to convince everyone else of that, starting with the man whose eyes seemed to pierce right through him, Drill Sergeant Hammer. This was a different kind of stage, and the performance had just begun. Days bled into a relentless cycle. Revealed before dawn, the blare of the bugle, a rude awakening. Physical training that pushed every muscle to its screaming limit. Drills, marching, endless repetitions of left, right, left. Barracks inspections where every crease in a bedsheet, every speck of dust was scrutinized with the intensity of a diamond appraiser. Drill Sergeant Hammer was a constant presence, a looming shadow of discipline. He moved with a coiled energy, his voice a perpetual low rumble that could erupt into a thunderclap at the slightest infraction, and his favorite target, it seemed, was Private Presley. "Presley, your bed's a disgrace. You sleep on a satin sheet at home, boy. This ain't Graceland," Hammer would bellow, pulling a perfectly tucked corner loose with a flick of his wrist. Elvis would respond with a crisp, "No, Drill Sergeant," and immediately set about remaking his bunk, striving for military perfection. He never argued. He never complained. He just did. Each time he felt a strange mix of frustration and a quiet satisfaction that he hadn't cracked. During physical training, PT, Hammer seemed to have a special interest in Elvis's performance. While the other recruits might get a general bark, Elvis received specific targeted encouragement, which often sounded more like taunting. "Pick up the pace, Presley. Thought you were famous for your moves. Or maybe that only applies to shaking your hips on stage." Hammer would yell as Elvis struggled through a set of burpees, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. Elvis would dig deeper, pushing himself harder. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he kept going. He wasn't the fastest, not by a long shot. Some of the farm boys and factory workers in the platoon were natural athletes, their bodies already hardened by manual labor. But Elvis, despite his initial struggles, showed a quiet, relentless determination. He didn't quit. He didn't fall out. His fellow recruits watched him, fascinated. At first, there was a palpable buzz whispers, following him everywhere. "It's really Elvis." But as the days turned into a week, then two, the novelty began to wear off, replaced by something else. They saw him struggling just like them. They saw him getting yelled at, just like them. They saw him covered in mud, just like them. "Hey, Presley, you okay there?" One recruit, a quiet kid named Billy, asked him one evening as they shined their boots in the barracks. Billy had always seemed a bit intimidated by Elvis's presence. Elvis looked up, a smear of polish on his cheek. "Yeah, Billy, just tired you?" "Same, my feet feel like someone ran 'em over with a truck." Billy chuckled, a genuine sound. "Never thought I'd see Elvis Presley scrubbing a latrine." Elvis grinned, a rare, easy smile that was more about camaraderie than showmanship. "Gets you grounded, don't it?" He was trying to blend in, to be just another private. He listened more than he spoke, observed the routines, learned from the mistakes of others. He helped where he could, quietly. When a fellow recruit, overwhelmed and confused during rifle assembly, Fumbled with a part, Elvis leaned over, speaking softly. "Try turning it this way, Jimmy. It locks in easier." Jimmy looked up, surprised, then nodded gratefully. Hammer saw these moments. He saw Elvis not just taking the abuse, but responding to it. He saw him not just struggling, but pushing through. He saw him not just being a celebrity among civilians, but a soldier among soldiers. The drill sergeant still saw the king and Presley, but he was starting to see the man, too. And the man was surprisingly resilient. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling session of marching drills under the blazing Texas sun, a recruit collapsed. Private Miller, a tall, gangly kid, stumbled and crumpled to the ground, pale and panting. "Get up, Miller. What are you?" "A daisy," Hammer roared, already striding towards him. Before Hammer could reach him, Elvis, who was marching 2 rows behind, broke ranks for a split second, nudged a canteen with his foot. "Hey, Miller, easy does it." "Take a sip?" Hammer froze his eyes like daggers. Breaking ranks was a serious offense. He opened his mouth to unleash a torrent of reprimand. Then he saw Elvis discreetly slide his own canteen closer to Miller, making it seem like an accident. He wasn't making a show of it. He was just helping. Hammer hesitated, his jaw clenched. He looked from Elvis to Miller, who was slowly taking a grateful sip. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost a hiss. He didn't add an apology, didn't make an excuse, just a direct acknowledgement. Hammer stared at him for a long moment, then turned and stalked away. He hadn't punished Elvis. He hadn't even truly yelled at him. The other recruits noticed a ripple of something. Surprise, perhaps a flicker of respect went through the ranks. Elvis returned to his marching, his heart beating a little faster. He still felt Hammer's scrutiny, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't purely hostile anymore. The green machine was grinding, and Private Presley was slowly but surely becoming part of its gears. He knew the road ahead was long, but he was determined to walk it every step of the way. The dreaded shakedown happened once a week. It was a thorough, unannounced inspection of the barracks designed to catch recruits off guard and reinforce the importance of constant vigilance and cleanliness. For Drill Sergeant Hammer, it was also another prime opportunity to find fault, especially with Private Presley. Platoon was assembled outside, standing at attention in the Texas heat, while the drill sergeants moved through the barracks like a pack of wolves, sniffing out imperfections. The air was thick with tension. Every man knew a single misplaced sock could earn the entire platoon extra duty. Elvis felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He tried his best to keep his area pristine. His footlocker was organized, his clothes folded meticulously, his bed tightly made. He'd even polished the scuff marks off the floorboards around his bunk, trying to anticipate. Finally, Hammer emerged, a grim expression on his face. He strode directly to Elvis, stopping inches from his face. "Presley," Hammer's voice was low, dangerous. "Care to explain this, Private?" He held up the paper. It was a candy wrapper, a discarded wrapper from a peanut bar, obviously old and forgotten. He'd found it tucked away, almost hidden, under Elvis's pillow. Elvis's heart sank. He racked his brain. He hadn't had a candy bar in days. He'd been so careful. "Drill Sergeant, I don't know where that came from. I haven't had candy." Hammer's eyes narrowed. "Don't know, Private. That's not good enough. Did it just magically appear under your pillow, Presley? Perhaps a gift from a secret fan?" He held it up for the other recruits to see. A small, pathetic piece of trash. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the ranks. Elvis felt his face flush. The humiliation was a familiar burn, but it was sharper now, because he truly felt wronged. He had been so diligent. "Sir, I assure you it's not mine," Elvis insisted, his voice quiet but firm. He could feel the eyes of his fellow recruits on him. Some sympathetic, some perhaps wondering if he was just trying to get out of trouble. Hammer scoffed. "Not yours. Everything in your personal space is your responsibility. Private? Or does the king have special rules for his garbage?" He leaned in, his voice a harsh whisper. "You think you can just cruise through here, Presley? Let others pick up your slack well, not on my watch. He straightened up. This kind of sloppiness is a disgrace. It shows a lack of discipline, a lack of respect for yourself and your platoon. And for that, Private, you've earned us all extra duty, latrine duty, every single one of you, thanks to Private Presley's royal mess. A collective groan went through the ranks. Elvis felt a surge of guilt, hot and bitter. It wasn't his rapper, he was sure of it. But now everyone was being punished because of him. He looked at his feet, unable to meet the angry or disappointed gazes of his bunkmates. I said, "Drill sergeant?" Hammer barked, waiting for Elvis's standard response. Elvis straightened his shoulders, looked Hammer dead in the eye, and, despite the burning shame, spoke clearly, "Yes, drill sergeant." His voice was steady, devoid of anger or defeat. Just acknowledgement. Hammer watched him for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. He had expected an argument, a plea, a show of frustration. He got none of it, just a soldier accepting punishment, even if unjust. It was. Later that evening, as the platoon scrubbed toilets and mopped floors, the mood was sullen. No one spoke directly to Elvis about the candy wrapper, but the tension was thick. He worked in silence, scrubbing harder than anyone, trying to atone for something he didn't do. Suddenly, a quiet voice spoke beside him. It was Billy. "Hey." Saw Jenkins toss it. He was eating it this morning, trying to hide it from the sergeants. Must have just tucked it under your pillow to get rid of it before the shakedown. He's always trying to pull one over in fresh anger. Relief that his instincts were right, anger at Jenkins for his casual betrayal. But he didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly. Billy had seen, and that was enough. It meant not everyone thought he was a privileged slob. The incident, however, reinforced Hammer's perception of Elvis as someone who brought trouble, even if he didn't seek it. Continued to watch Elvis with a hawk's eye, pushing him relentlessly. During rifle cleaning, a task that required meticulous precision, Hammer would stand over Elvis, criticizing every move. "That's not clean, Presley. I can still see carbon in the barrel. You're going to protect your country with a dirty weapon." Elvis would patiently re-clean the rifle again and again until it passed inspection, his hands growing numb from the solvents. He felt clumsy, inadequate at these tasks. His hands were made for strumming guitars, not disassembling firing pins. Yet he persevered. He was learning, he was adapting, and with each trial, even the unfair ones, he was growing. He was proving to himself, and perhaps eventually to Hammer, that there was more to the king than just a crown. There was a soldier beneath the uniform struggling to emerge. The field training exercises were a brutal awakening. Days spent out in the wilderness, sleeping in tents, eating reeds that tasted like cardboard, and navigating obstacle courses designed to break both body and spirit. The mud pit was legendary, a deep, viscous trench that swallowed boots whole and coated everything in a thick brown slime. "All right, recruits, this is the mongoose pit. You get in, you get across, and you get out. Failure to complete means you start again, understand?" "Drill!" Sergeant Hammer yelled, his voice echoing over the grunts and splashes of the men already attempting the course. Elvis watched as the men ahead of him sank into the muddy depths, struggling to pull their legs free. Slipping and sliding, disgusting and utterly demoralizing. "Presley, you're up." Hammer's voice cut through his thoughts. Elvis took a deep breath and plunged in. The mud instantly sucked at his boots, pulling him down. He stumbled, his hands sinking into the mire as he tried to catch himself. A wave of cold, slimy water washed over his face. He coughed, spitting out mud. "Come on, King, you gonna get dirty now?" Hammer taunted, standing at the edge of the pit, his arms crossed, watching with unblinking intensity. "What's the matter? Afraid to mess up your pretty hair?" Elvis ignored him, focusing on the sheer physical effort of moving. Each step was a monumental struggle. Pulled his legs free with a squelching sound, only for his foot to sink back into a different spot. He was covered from head to toe in thick brown sludge. His uniform felt heavy, clinging to him. He pushed forward, his muscles screaming. He could hear the grunts of other recruits, the frustrated curses, the occasional splash of someone falling. He saw some men give up, collapsing in the mud, waiting for assistance, but Elvis kept moving. Slowly, painfully, he dragged himself inch by inch across the pit. He was halfway across when he heard a cry behind him. "I'm stuck. I can't move." It was Private Henderson, a smaller recruit who was clearly struggling. He was bogged down, one leg sunk deep, his face pale with exertion and fear. He was starting to panic. Hammer was already shouting, "Henderson, get yourself out of there, Private." But Henderson was truly stuck, almost immobile. Elvis, though exhausted himself, looked back. He could just keep going, finish the course, and be done with the mud. He was almost there, but he couldn't just leave Henderson without a moment's hesitation. Elvis turned around. He waded back through the thick mud, pushing against the suction until he reached Henderson. "Hey, easy, Henderson," Elvis said, his voice raspy from exertion. "Don't fight it so hard. Let me help." He reached out a muddy hand. Henderson, grateful, grabbed it. "I'm stuck, Presley. Really stuck." "I got you," Elvis said. He braced his feet, found a firmer patch of ground, and pulled. He strained his own feet, slipping, but he pulled with all his might. Henderson slowly, with a loud squelch, freed his leg. "Thanks," man, Henderson gasped, leaning against Elvis, both of them covered in mud, breathing heavily. "No problem," Elvis replied. "Now come on, we finish this together." They pushed forward, Elvis taking the lead, occasionally pulling Henderson free from particularly sticky spots. They were slower than ever, but they were moving. Hammer had stopped shouting. He stood silent at the edge of the pit. Watch. He saw Elvis, not the celebrity, not the pampered star, but the soldier who turned back for a comrade. He saw him covered in mud, exhausted but still reaching out to help. Finally, they reached the end of the pit. Elvis pulled himself out, then helped Henderson scramble onto firm ground. They stood there, dripping with mud, panting, utterly spent. Hammer walked over to them. His eyes were still intense, but the usual contempt wasn't there. He looked at Elvis, then at Henderson, then back at Elvis. "Presley," Hammer said, his voice surprisingly quiet, "you finished." It wasn't a compliment, not a word of praise, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement. "Clean yourselves up," Hammer finally said, his voice back to its usual gruffness, but there was a subtle shift in his tone. "Move. We got more to do." As Elvis and Henderson trudged to the washing station, the other recruits watched them. No one whispered about Elvis's fame this time. Instead, a few of them nodded, a silent recognition passing between them. Elvis had proven himself not just as a survivor, but as a comrade. And in the mud-soaked crucible of basic training that was worth more than any #1 hit, he had just earned something precious, something that couldn't be bought or sold. A quiet measure of respect. The evenings in the barracks were usually a mixture of exhaustion and restless energy. After the long days of drills and training, some men wrote letters home, some played cards, others just lay on their bunks staring at the ceiling. The radio was a forbidden luxury, so silence or the murmur of hushed conversations filled the air. One night, the monotony was broken by the quiet strumming of a guitar. It wasn't Elvis's guitar. He hadn't brought one. This was a beat-up acoustic, passed around by a few of the recruits who knew how to play a chord or two. Tonight, it was in the hands of Private Ramirez, a shy kid from Texas who was trying to pick out a simple tune. He wasn't very good. "Ah, Ramirez, give it up, man," someone groaned good-naturedly. "My ears are bleeding." Ramirez flushed, embarrassed, and was about to put the guitar down. "Here, let me see that for a minute," a voice said. It was Elvis. He hadn't said much, mostly kept to himself in the evenings, but the sound of the guitar seemed to draw him in. Ramirez looked surprised, then hesitantly handed over the instrument. The other recruits watched, curious. They knew Elvis could sing, of course, everyone knew, but they'd only seen the stage persona, the hip, swiveling, high-energy rock and roll king. What would he do here? In a dusty barracks, Elvis took the guitar. His fingers, usually so quick and fluid, felt a little stiff from the day's manual labor, but they still found their way around the fretboard with an instinctive ease. He plucked a few strings, adjusting the tuning by ear. The sound was thin, tinny, but in his hands even this cheap guitar began to hum. He didn't launch into hound dog or jailhouse rock. Instead, he started to play a simple, heartfelt melody. Then he began to sing. It wasn't the powerful, booming voice of his records, but a softer, more intimate tone. He sang a gospel hymn, an old spiritual something he'd learned in church as a boy. His voice filled the barracks, gentle and pure, full of a quiet longing. It was a familiar song to many of the men, a sound of home, of comfort, of Sunday mornings. The raucous energy of the barracks slowly faded. Men stopped their card games, put down their letters. Elvis's eyes were closed as he sang, lost in the music, no longer performing for a crowd, but simply sharing a piece of his soul. He wasn't the king now. He was just a man singing a hymn. The words resonated with the weariness and uncertainty of their lives as recruits. Peace in the valley, for me, someday. The song ended, and for a moment silence hung in the air, broken only by the hum of the barracks' fluorescent lights. No applause, no cheers, just a quiet, collected breath. Elvis opened his eyes, a shy smile on his face. He handed the guitar back to Ramirez. "She's got a good heart, this one," he said, tapping the instrument. Ramirez took the guitar, his eyes wide. That was beautiful, Presley. Thank you." The other recruits nodded, some mumbling their appreciation. It was a different kind of performance, one that broke down the barriers of fame and showed them the human being underneath. Just then a shadow fell across the doorway. Drill Sergeant Hammer. He had been doing his rounds, checking on the barracks. He had heard the singing. He had paused unseen in the shadows, listening to Elvis's voice. He hadn't made a sound, he hadn't said a word, but he had heard the melody, the quiet reverence in the barracks. He saw the way the men looked at Elvis, not as a celebrity, but as someone who had offered them a moment of peace, a connection to something deeper. Hammer stood there for a few more seconds, his face unreadable in the dim light, then turned and continued his rounds. He said nothing about the music, nothing about the unmilitary quiet that had settled over the barracks. He had always seen Elvis as a showman, someone who needed the spotlight. Tonight he saw a different kind of performance, one without flash or fanfare, purely from the heart. It was a quiet moment, but for Hammer it chipped away at another layer of his prejudice. He was starting to realize that the man in front of him wasn't just a flashy entertainer. He was a man capable of quiet strength and unexpected depth. King had offered them solace, and the drill sergeant had seen it. The respect was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to grow. The long march was a rite of passage, a true test of endurance and grit. They had been on their feet for hours, miles blurring into one another, heavy packs digging into their shoulders, rifles feeling heavier with each passing step. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, and the dusty road seemed endless. Elvis, like every other recruit, was feeling the strain. His boots, once stiff, now felt like lead weights on his blistered feet. His shoulders ached from the weight of his pack, and his mouth was dry, despite the meager sips from his canteen. His usual boundless energy felt drained, replaced by a dull, persistent ache in every limb. "Keep it up, men. We're almost there." Drill Sergeant Hammer's voice, though hoarse, still carried a surprising amount of power. He marched alongside them, seemingly tireless, a constant reminder of their goal. Suddenly a cry broke the rhythm of their marching. Private Johnson, a sturdy, usually resilient recruit, stumbled. "Can't move." "Drill Sergeant?" "My leg." He winced, clearly in pain. Blisters, exhaustion, perhaps a strained muscle. Elvis, who was marching a few paces ahead, looked back. He knew that feeling of absolute exhaustion, the moment your body just quits. He was close to it himself, but he also saw the look in Johnson's eyes, the shame, the defeat. Without a second thought, Elvis broke rank. He walked over to Johnson, dropping his own pack with a thud beside him. Hammer, seeing the movement, stopped, his eyes narrowing. "What do you think you're doing, Presley?" Hammer's voice was a low growl, promising trouble. "Give me your pack." Johnson stared at him, confused. "What? No, Presley, you don't have to." "Just give it," Elvis insisted. He picked up Johnson's pack, hefting it. It was heavy, even heavier than his own. Paused for a moment, then with a grunt slung it over his other shoulder. Now he carried 2 packs. Hammer watched, his jaw slightly agape. This wasn't a show of bravado, it was an act of raw, unselfish assistance. Elvis was clearly exhausted himself, but he was taking on an extra burden. "Presley, are you out of your mind?" Hammer demanded, his voice a mix of disbelief and something else, something bordering on respect. "No, drill sergeant," Elvis replied, his voice firm though strained by the double load. "Can't walk, sir. I'll carry his pack. He can make it with just his rifle." Johnson, seeing the determination in Elvis's eyes and desperate to avoid being left behind, slowly managed to push himself up, leaning on his rifle as a crutch hammer, stood there, silent, watching the 2 recruits. He saw the grim set of Elvis's jaw, the slight tremor in his legs as he adjusted to the weight. He saw not the star, but the soldier sacrificing his own comfort for a comrade. It was a clear, unambiguous act of solidarity. "All right," Hammer finally said, his voice surprisingly subdued. "Johnson, you fall in behind Presley, stay together. And you 2, he barked at a couple of other recruits, help Johnson along if he starts to lag." Elvis nodded, adjusting the straps of the 2 packs. He looked back at Johnson, a weary but encouraging smile on his face. "Come on, Johnson, we got this." And they resumed the march. Elvis, weighed down by 2 packs, still managed to keep a steady pace. He occasionally hummed a quiet tune, something to distract from the pain, something to lift their spirits. He offered words of encouragement to Johnson, who hobbled along beside him. Hammer fell back, slightly watching them. He had seen many recruits break down on marches, seen them helped by their comrades, but this was different. This was Elvis Presley, the man he had been trying to break, the celebrity he had dismissed as soft, carrying the load of another. Without a shred of hesitation, he was leading, not with shouts but with quiet strength and example. The long march eventually ended. They limped into camp, utterly spent. But they had all made it. Elvis dropped the 2 packs, collapsing beside them, breathing heavily but with a fierce satisfaction in his eyes. Hammer walked over to him, standing silently for a moment. He looked down at Elvis, still covered in sweat and grime, then at the 2 pack. He still didn't say anything explicitly complimentary, but the look in his eyes was different. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a dawning recognition. Elvis Presley wasn't just a face on a magazine cover. He was a soldier, and that simple, selfless act on the long march had just sealed it. Basic training wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about learning to function as a unit. And nothing tested that like the team exercises. This particular morning they were faced with a complex task: assembling a heavy-duty communication antenna under a strict time limit, simulating a battlefield scenario. Chaos quickly ensued. "All right, listen up, you blockheads. This antenna needs to be up and running in 15 minutes. Your lives depend on it. Move!" "Drill, Sergeant," Hammer barked, pacing around the assembly area. The recruits, already frazzled from a sleepless night and an early morning run, fumbled with the heavy metal poles and intricate wiring. Someone dropped a piece. Someone else tightened a bolt too much, stripping the thread. Commands were yelled, contradicted, ignored. Communication antenna, instead of rising, looked more like a metal octopus losing a fight. "This is a disaster," Hammer roared, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "What are you, toddlers? You call this teamwork?" Elvis, usually quiet during these exercises, observed the escalating confusion. He saw the raw potential of his fellow recruits, their eagerness to do well, but also their lack of direction. He'd seen chaos on stage before, moments when an amplifier died or a microphone cut out, and he knew how to bring a situation back from the brink. It wasn't about shouting, it was about calm, clear. He watched for another moment. Then almost instinctively he stepped forward. He didn't yell. His voice, while firm, was conversational, cutting through the din without adding. "One thing at a time," Elvis said, his voice carrying surprising authority. The other recruits, surprised, actually quieted down. Even Hammer paused. Watching, Elvis pointed to a large, flat base plate. "Smith, Johnson, you 2 get the base leveled and secured. Make sure it's dead even." He then looked at the tangle of poles. "Ramirez, you know how these poles fit together, right? Start sorting them by length. Let's get a system going." He then addressed the men wrestling with the wires. "Billy, you're good with wires, right? Get those connectors sorted. And Jones, get a wrench for him." He moved deliberately, not rushing, but his actions were precise. He didn't take over every task, but delegated, empowering each man with a clear job. He saw the strengths of his fellow recruits and assigned them roles that matched. He didn't show off, he simply directed. "No, not like that," someone cried out as two recruits pulled in opposite directions on a pole. Elvis calmly walked over. Hold on. Easy. We need to lift, and then sly, wide. 1, 2, 3. They listened, they followed his lead. The chaotic energy began to shift into focused effort. Men who had been bickering moments before were now working together, spurred by Elvis's calm, steady presence. He moved from one group to another, offering quiet advice, a word of encouragement, a quick demonstration of how a piece fit. Hammer stood back, arms crossed, his usual scowl replaced by a look of utter astonishment. He had tried shouting, threatening, cajoling. Nothing had worked like this. Elvis wasn't just working, he was leading. He wasn't giving orders like a drill sergeant, he was guiding them, building a team out of a group of frantic individuals. The antennas slowly, steadily began to take shape. Poles clicked into place. The wires were connected, the base secured. The recruits, once frustrated, now worked with a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer just following orders. They were part of a cohesive unit, driven by a shared goal, and led by someone they were beginning to trust implicitly. With 2 minutes to spare, the antennas stood tall and straight, ready for operation. "Antenna secure, Drill Sergeant," Elvis announced, his voice slightly breathless, but filled with quiet satisfaction. Hammer walked over to the finished antenna, inspecting it closely. He ran a hand over a tightened bolt, checked a connection. It was perfect, better than perfect. Considering the initial chaos, he turned to the platoon, his gaze sweeping over them, then settling on Elvis. His face was still stern, but his eyes held a new light. "All right, you sorry bunch of grunts," he said, his voice still gruff. "You finally managed to do something right. And that, Private Presley, was, well, that was something." He didn't offer a direct compliment, not in front of the whole platoon, but the tone was different. There was no sarcasm, no contempt, just a grudging, profound acknowledgement. He then looked at the entire platoon. "You want to be soldiers. You want to survive out there. You gotta work together. You gotta listen. You gotta lead. And sometimes," he glanced at Elvis, "you gotta let someone else lead when they know what they're doing." It was as close to a public endorsement as Hammer was likely to give. The other recruits looked at Elvis with new eyes, not just admiration for his fame, but genuine respect for his capabilities. Elvis hadn't sought the leadership role. It had come to him naturally, a testament to his innate ability to connect with people and guide them. The turning point for Hammer was clear. Elvis wasn't just a celebrity playing soldier, he was a leader in the making. The next few days felt different. The air in the barracks, the tone of the drill sergeants, even the way the other recruits looked at Elvis, everything had subtly shifted. Drill Sergeant Hammer was still tough, still demanded perfection, but the cutting edge of his criticism towards Elvis had dulled. The relentless targeting was gone, replaced by a watchful, almost curious observation. One afternoon, after a particularly rigorous session of bayonet training, Hammer called Elvis aside. The other recruits slowly dispersed, leaving Elvis alone with the drill sergeant. Elvis braced himself, expecting a final private dressing, then a last attempt to exert dominance. Hammer stood silently for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "Presley," he finally said, his voice lower than usual, almost conversational, though still firm. "You're a long way from Memphis, ain't you?" Elvis nodded. "Yes, drill sergeant." "You came in here." Hammer continued, his eyes piercing. "And I saw a civilian, a pampered celebrity. Someone who thought he could just glide through on his name. I figured you'd fold. I figured you'd complain." Wine. Kuntas stood silently listening. He remembered those early days, the overwhelming exhaustion, the constant feeling of being under a microscope. "But you didn't," Hammer said, a hint of something unreadable in his voice. "You took everything I threw at you. You kept your mouth shut. You worked. You pushed. You got up when you fell. And you didn't just look out for yourself out there." He paused, his gaze intense. "That stunt with Johnson's pack, that wasn't for show, was it?" "No, Drill Sergeant. He needed help," Elvis replied simply. Hammer nodded slowly. "And that antenna? You took charge, didn't ask for it. Just did it. You got those men working like a well-oiled machine." Elvis felt a flicker of surprise. Hammer was actually acknowledging fault, but stating facts. "I've been in this army a long time, Presley," Hammer continued, his voice gruff. "Seen a lot of men come through here. Some break, some make it through, just barely, and some surprise you." He took a step closer, his eyes still holding Elvis's. "I judged you, Presley. Judged you by your records, by your public image. And I was wrong." The words were delivered without fanfare, without apology, but the meaning was clear. It was a concession, a rare admission from a man who prided himself on never being wrong. Elvis felt a warmth spread through him. This was it. This was the respect he had quietly been seeking, not the roar of the crowd, but the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had tried to break him and failed. "I'm just trying to do my duty, Drill," Sergeant Elvis said, his voice humble. "Serve my country like any other man." Hammer's lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Well, Private Presley," he said, "you're doing a damn fine job of it." He looked at Elvis, really looked at him, then nodded. "Dismissed, Presley." "Yes, Drill Sergeant," Elvis said, a crispness to his voice he hadn't had before. He turned and walked away, a sense of lightness in his step. The weight of being the king had been heavy here, but the uniform had allowed him to shed it, to prove himself as a man, as a soldier. And Drill Sergeant Hammer, the hardest judge of all, had finally seen it. The other recruits watching from a distance saw the quiet conversation, the way Hammer had addressed Elvis, and the subtle but unmistakable shift in the drill sergeant's demeanor. They saw Elvis walk away, not with a look of relief, but of quiet pride. The message was clear. Elvis Presley had earned his stripes. He wasn't just a curiosity anymore, he was one of them. He was a soldier, respected by the toughest man in the camp. The air was different now, clearer. The respect was no longer just a flicker. It was a steady, growing flame. With Drill Sergeant Hammer's tacit approval and the platoon's growing understanding, the dynamic in the barracks shifted completely. Elvis was no longer the king over. Private Jenkins, the same one who'd nearly gotten Elvis in trouble with the candy wrapper, asked one evening during chow, his tone easy and familiar. Elvis grinned, pulling a small, smuggled bottle from his duffel bag. "Only for my favorite latrine scrubber, Jenkins. You earned it." A ripple of laughter went around their table. The old incident, once a source of tension, was now just a shared joke. They talked about home, about their hopes for after basic training, about the ridiculousness of some of the drills. Elvis listened to their stories, sharing his own, not about the glamour of his career, but about his family, his upbringing, the simple joys of life back in Memphis. He wasn't just a singer anymore. He was a man from Tupelo, Mississippi, who happened to have a unique talent. During drills, if someone struggled, Elvis was there, with a quiet word of encouragement, a quick demonstration, a helping hand. He didn't just endure the training. He embraced it, pushing himself and subtly motivating those around him. He showed them how to polish their boots to a mirror shine, how to tie their knots faster, even a trick or two to make the cleaning of their M1 rifles a little quicker. One particularly cold night, the heating unit in their barracks failed. Temperature dropped quickly, and the men huddled in their thin blankets, shivering. It was a miserable night. "Man, I can't feel my toes," Billy muttered, pulling his blanket tighter. Elvis, ever the quick thinker, saw a solution. "All right, everyone, let's get some more body heat going. Who knows a good campfire story?" Soon the barracks was filled with low voices sharing tales, some true, some exaggerated, all designed to distract from the chill. Then Elvis quietly began to hum a familiar tune. It was slow, soulful, and soon others picked up the melody, humming along a collective warmth, spreading from their shared voices. It wasn't a performance, it was just men finding comfort in each other. Even Drill Sergeant Hammer noticed the change. He still came through the barracks inspecting, shouting orders, but his eyes were different. He saw the camaraderie, the way the men pulled together. He saw Elvis not as the outlier, but as a crucial part of the fabric of the platoon. He even started calling him Presley, with a slight, almost imperceptible softening in his tone, rather than the sharp, accusatory Presley from before. One afternoon during a break, Hammer walked over to their group. The men instantly snapped to attention. "At ease," Hammer said, his voice surprisingly mild. He looked at Elvis. "Presley, I hear you've been helping some of these numbskulls with their rifle cleaning." Elvis felt a small flush. "Just lending a hand, Drill Sergeant?" Hammer nodded. "Good, because if any of their rifles fail inspection, it's all on you, you hear?" He paused. Then a flicker of something close to a smile touched his lips. "Keep it up. We need every man sharp." It wasn't a compliment, not directly, but it was an acknowledgement of Elvis's positive influence. It was Drill Sergeant Hammer in his own gruff way, showing that he approved. As the weeks dwindled down to days, a shared sense of accomplishment began to settle over the platoon. They had come in as raw civilians, and they were leaving as soldiers. They had sweated, bled, and cursed together. They had endured Hammer's relentless training, and they had come out stronger together. Elvis felt a profound sense of belonging. He hadn't anticipated. The fame had always set him apart, but here in the Army, stripped of all the trappings, he had found a different kind of connection, a deeper kinship. He was no longer just Elvis Presley, the star. He was Private Presley, part of a brotherhood forged in the crucible of basic training. And it felt good, truly good. Graduation day arrived, bathed in the same hot Texas sun that had overseen their grueling transformation. Parade ground, once a stage for Hammer's thunderous pronouncements, was now filled with families, cameras, and the nervous excitement of men about to transition from recruits to full-fledged soldiers. Elvis looked out at the assembled families. His own parents, Gladys and Vernon, couldn't be there in person, but he felt their presence, their pride in his heart. He knew they were watching from afar, just as proud of him in his uniform as they were of him on any stage. The platoon stood at rigid attention, their uniforms crisp, their boots polished to perfection. They were leaner, stronger, their faces etched with the discipline they had earned. Gone were the hesitant shuffles. Every movement was now precise, sharp. Drill Sergeant Hammer stood before them, his posture as unyielding as always, but there was a subtle change in his eyes, a flicker of something akin to pride. He surveyed his platoon, the men he had pushed to their limits, the men he had transformed. "All right, listen up, you soldiers," Hammer's voice boomed, but today there was no anger, no taunt, just authority laced with a deep, resonating satisfaction. 8 weeks ago, you stepped off those buses looking like a bunch of lost puppies. Soft, scared, and green as grass. You stumbled, you complained, some of you even cried. A few chuckles rippled through the parents, but you didn't quit. Hammer's voice rose, filled with a raw, undeniable pride. You dug deep, you pushed past your limits, you learned what it means to be a soldier, to put your brother before yourself, to fight for what's right. You are no longer civilians, you are soldiers of the United States Army. and I am proud to have called myself your drill sergeant." Cheer erupted, a powerful, emotional roar from the new soldiers. They had earned his praise, and it felt like the greatest reward. Hammer then looked directly at Elvis, his gaze holding for a beat longer than on anyone else. He didn't single him out with words, not in front of the assembled crowd, but the look conveyed everything. It was a silent salute. "Real good." Elvis grasped the drill sergeant's hand. Hammer's grip was firm, strong. It wasn't just a handshake, it was a culmination. It was respect earned brick by painstaking brick, through sweat, mud, and unwavering determination. "Thank you, Drill," Sergeant Elvis said, his voice sincere, filled with genuine gratitude. He meant it. Hammer had been hard, but he had forged him. "Now go on," Hammer said, a rare small smile finally touching his lips. "Go be a soldier and try not to cause too much trouble out there, King." The nickname, uttered now with warmth and a touch of wry humor, felt different. It wasn't a taunt anymore. It was an acknowledgement of who he was, combined with an acceptance of who he had become, a respected soldier. Elvis nodded, a lump in his throat. He turned and walked towards his waiting comrades, who clapped him on the back, grinning. He was no longer just the celebrity in uniform. He was Private Presley, part of their unit, a man who had faced every challenge and emerged stronger as he walked away. Elvis looked back over his shoulder. Drill Sergeant Hammer was still standing there, watching his platoon disperse, a solitary figure of unwavering discipline and unexpected warmth. Elvis realized that in coming to the Army, he hadn't just given up 2 years of his career. He had gained something invaluable. He had proven to himself and to the world that he was more than just a performer. He was a man of substance, character, and duty. The uniform felt heavier now, not with the weight of expectation, but with the quiet dignity of having earned his place. He was a soldier, and he walked with the newfound confidence of a man who had earned, truly earned, the respect of those who mattered most.